My name is Walt Bregman, and for 31 years I've worked the same 160 acres my grandfather bought back in 1954. It's not a big operation by modern standards. Hay, a small herd of cattle, some pumpkins, and sweet corn I sell at the roadside stand every fall. But it's mine, free, and clear, and the gravel road that cuts through the north pasture and connects my equipment barn to the county highway has belonged to this farm since before the interstate existed. My grandfather graded that road himself with a borrowed dozer. My father repaired the culvert after the flood of '78. I've patched the potholes every spring for 3 decades. It is, in every sense that matters, ours. I never imagined that a strip of gravel and dirt would become the center of a battle that would drag in a homeowners association, a county surveyor, a lawyer with more confidence than sense, and eventually the very first survey ever filed on this land. But that's exactly what happened, and I want to tell you the whole thing from the beginning, because the ending still makes me shake my head in disbelief. To understand why that road matters so much, you have to understand a little about how this farm works. The road isn't just a convenience, it's the backbone of the whole operation. It's the route my hay trailer takes from the north field to the barn during summer cutting season. It's how the cattle truck gets in every fall when we ship calves to auction. It's how the propane company reaches my tank, how the vet gets to the barn when a cow is calving in the middle of the night, and how I get my own pickup out to the highway without tearing through soft pasture that my herd depends on for grazing. Every inch of that gravel was laid with a purpose, and every culvert and drainage ditch along it was dug by someone in my family who understood exactly why it needed to be there. It was never built to be pretty. It was built to work, and for 70 years, it has. My grandfather used to say that a farm without good roads is just a pile of dirt with fences around it, and he took real pride in maintaining that lane, even when money was tight. My father kept up the tradition, adding gravel every few years, clearing brush along the fence lines, and repairing the old wooden culvert after a bad flood nearly washed out the whole northern section back in 1978. By the time it came to me, that road wasn't just infrastructure. It was a small monument to 3 generations of stubborn, careful work, and I maintained it the same way they had, grading it every spring, hauling in fresh gravel every couple of years, and making sure the gate at both ends stayed locked, because keeping the herd contained and the property secure has always mattered on a working farm. So when Deborah Kowalski showed up at my gate with a phone full of screenshots insisting that this same road was somehow shared property, it didn't just feel like a legal disagreement. It felt like someone trying to rewrite history in the span of a single afternoon. It started 3 years ago, when a developer bought the old Hutchins place, 200 acres that used to be pasture land butting up against my property line on the east side. Within 18 months, that pasture land had become Meadow Ridge Estates, 64 houses packed onto lots barely big enough for a swing set, all connected by curving streets with names like Tranquil Brook Lane and Whispering Oak Court. I didn't think much of it at first. Developments happen. Farms shrink and subdivisions grow, and as long as they stayed on their side of the fence, I figured we could coexist. I was wrong about that, and her name was Deborah Kowalski. Deborah was the president of the Meadow Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, and if you've ever dealt with someone like her, you already know the type. She drove a white SUV with a board-certified HOA parking placard in the windshield. She wore a visor even when it wasn't sunny, and she had a laminated binder of community bylaws that she carried into every conversation like it was scripture. I met her for the first time about 4 months after the first families moved in, when she pulled her SUV right up to my closed farm gate, got out, and started photographing my no trespassing sign like it was evidence of a crime. "Excuse me," she said when I walked over. "Is this road part of the subdivision easement?" "No, I said. "This is my farm road. It runs from my equipment barn to the highway. It's private." She looked at her phone, squinted at some kind of map application, and said, "That's strange, because according to the county GIS system, this road is listed as a shared access route." I told her I didn't know anything about that, but that the road had been in my family since 1954, that it crossed entirely through my property, and that there was a locked gate at both ends specifically because it was private. She smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, thanked me for my time, and drove off. I figured that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived from the Meadow Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. It informed me that the North Access Corridor, my farm road, had been identified as a legacy public thoroughfare and that, per a resolution passed by the HOA board, residents of Meadow Ridge Estates would begin using it as a secondary route to reach the county highway, since the subdivision's main entrance was apparently causing traffic backups during school drop-off hours. The letter cited county mapping records and closed with a not-so-subtle threat that any attempt to obstruct public access could result in a formal complaint to the county's road department. I read that letter about 4 times, and each time I got a little more irritated. This wasn't a public road. It had never been a public road. There was no shared easement recorded anywhere that I knew of, and certainly none that my grandfather or father had ever mentioned. I called the county road department myself the next morning, and a very patient woman named Carol told me that, as far as the county's records showed, no public funds had ever been used to maintain that road, which usually meant it wasn't a public route, but she suggested I dig up my deed and any survey documents to be sure, since sometimes older properties had confusing or incomplete paperwork. That was reasonable advice. I just didn't expect what I'd eventually find. In the meantime, Deborah wasn't waiting around. About a week after that first letter, I came out one morning to find a small group of Meadow Ridge residents had driven straight through my north gate, which, I'll admit, I'd left unlocked that particular morning because I was hauling a trailer through it myself, and used my farm road as a cut-through to the highway. 3 cars, one after another, kicking up dust past my barn, past my cattle, right through the middle of my working farm. When I called down to ask what on earth they were doing, one driver rolled down his window and said, cheerfully, "Deborah said this road's public now. Saves us 10 minutes getting to the highway." I want to be clear about something here, because I think it matters. I am not a hot-headed man. I don't believe in shouting matches, and I try to give people the benefit of the doubt before I assume the worst of them. So instead of losing my temper, I drove into town, requested a copy of my deed from the county recorder's office, and asked for anything else on file related to my property. Surveys, plats, easements, all of it. I wanted facts, not arguments. What I got back initially was a modern deed description, filed when my father transferred the property to me back in the 90s, and it was frustratingly vague about the road itself. It described the property boundaries using metes and bounds that referenced a farm access lane, but didn't spell out ownership of that lane in the kind of ironclad language I was hoping for. There was also, buried in the county's digital mapping system, a GIS layer that did indeed show a dotted line running along my road, labeled Access, Status Unverified. That dotted line, it turned out, was the entire basis for Deborah's claim. Someone, at some point, had entered incomplete data into a modern digitization project, and Deborah had taken status unverified to mean obviously belongs to everyone. I called Carol back at the road department, a little more rattled than before, and she admitted that GIS layers are often built off old aerial photography and incomplete historical records, and that unverified absolutely did not mean public. But she also said that without something more definitive, an original survey, a deed restriction, anything from before the road was digitized, it would be my word against the HOAs if this went to a dispute. That's when I decided to find the original survey. Not a summary, not a digital layer, but the actual paper document filed when my grandfather first purchased and platted this land back in 1954. While I searched, things at home kept getting worse. The HOA board, spearheaded by Deborah, sent a second letter, this one more aggressive, stating that if I continued to obstruct public access by keeping my gates locked, they would file a formal complaint with the county and potentially pursue legal action on behalf of their affected residents. They also, and this is the part that really got under my skin, put up their own temporary signage on county right-of-way near my property line, reading Meadow Ridge Shortcut, Community Access Road, with a hand-drawn arrow pointing straight at my gate. I went to one of their HOA meetings, mostly out of curiosity about how this whole thing had gotten so far. It was held in the clubhouse of the new subdivision, a building that still smelled like fresh paint, and Deborah ran the meeting from behind a podium with a gavel she clearly enjoyed tapping. When I raised my hand to speak, she reluctantly let me, and I explained, calmly, that the road was private, that it ran entirely through my land, that my family had maintained it for 70 years, and that I had never granted any easement to anyone. Deborah's response was something I will remember for a long time. She held up a printed screenshot of the county GIS map, waved it at the room like a trophy, and said, "The county's own records show this is a shared corridor. I'm sorry, Mr. Bregman, but you don't get to just decide the rules don't apply to you because your family's been here a long time. This is a community now, and communities need connectivity." The room, mostly new residents who didn't know me from Adam, murmured in agreement. A few people even clapped. One man near the back, who I later learned was on the HOA's landscaping committee, stood up and added that the road would be a huge win for morning commute times, as if 70 years of family history could simply be traded away for a 5-minute shortcut to the highway. Another woman asked whether the HOA might eventually pave the road, since gravel was hard on tires, and Deborah nodded along like that was a perfectly reasonable next step for property that wasn't hers to pave. I left that meeting angrier than I've been in years, but also more determined. If Deborah wanted to fight this with paperwork, I was going to bring better paperwork than she had ever seen. Over the next several days, the pressure only increased. Someone, I never found out who, though I have my suspicions, zip-tied a laminated community access road sign directly to my closed gate. I found it early one morning while doing rounds, cut it off with wire cutters, and set it on Deborah's porch that same afternoon without a word. She called the sheriff's non-emergency line to report it, and a deputy I've known for years, a fellow named Hank Ostrovsky, drove out, looked at the whole situation, shook his head, and told her gently that until ownership of the road was formally settled, there wasn't much he could do either way, but that trespassing complaints could go both directions just as easily. That seemed to take some of the wind out of her sails, at least for a little while. Then came the fines. About 2 weeks after the sign incident, I received a notice, not from the HOA, since I wasn't even a member of Meadow Ridge Estates, but a strange letter forwarded through the County Code Enforcement Office, filed by Deborah on behalf of the HOA, alleging that my locked gate constituted obstruction of a mapped access route and requesting an inspection. A code enforcement officer named Priya Anand called me directly, sounding almost apologetic, and explained that she was required to follow up on any formal complaint, even ones that seemed unusual. She drove out the following week, walked the road with me, looked over my deed and what documentation I had at the time, and told me candidly that nothing about my gate looked like a violation of anything, but that until there was something more definitive on file than a GIS placeholder, the complaints would likely keep coming. That conversation was the final push that sent me digging for the original 1954 survey in earnest. It took nearly 3 weeks of digging. My first stop was the county recorder's office downtown, a cramped room in the basement of the courthouse where an archivist named Sylvia pulled up what digital records existed for my parcel number. Most of what came back was from the 1990s onward, when the county first began digitizing property files, and none of it referenced anything older than my father's transfer deed. Sylvia suggested I try the older physical archive housed in a separate building across town, where pre-1980 documents were still stored on microfilm reels that had never been fully converted to digital format. That building turned out to be a maze of grey filing cabinets and a single working microfilm reader that groaned every time I advanced the film. I spent 2 entire afternoons scrolling through reels labelled only by decade and township, squinting at faded stamps and half-legible handwriting, before I found a name that stopped me cold: Elmer Whitfield, licensed surveyor, filing date March of 1954. I nearly missed it entirely, because the plat had been filed under the old combined name Hutchins-Bregman Tract, before the land was formally split between the two families. Around that same time, a woman at the local historical society mentioned, almost in passing, that there was a retired surveyor living out past the grain elevator who used to work fieldwork crews for the county back in the 60s and might remember something about that stretch of land. That was how I met Frank Delacroix, 86 years old, sharp as a tack, and delighted to have a visitor who wanted to talk shop about old survey work instead of asking him to mow his own lawn faster. Frank didn't remember the 1954 survey itself. He would have only been a teenager then, but he did remember, with startling clarity, helping set replacement monuments along that same boundary line in the early 1960s as a young surveyor's assistant, back when Elmer Whitfield himself was still consulting on county projects. He even remembered Whitfield's habit of adding handwritten notes to his official filings, something Frank said used to drive the county clerks crazy because it made the documents harder to standardize, but which turned out, 70 years later, to be exactly the kind of detail that would save my farm. What that survey showed changed everything. The original 1954 survey, conducted by a licensed surveyor named Elmer Whitfield and filed with the county recorder, clearly delineated the farm road as a private access easement, appurtenant to and for the sole benefit of the Bregman parcel, Tract 14. Not shared. Not public. Not a corridor for future development. It even included a handwritten notation from Whitfield himself, stating that the road was constructed at the sole expense of the Bregman family and was not intended for use by any other parcel, including the remainder of the Hutchins tract to the east, the very land that, 70 years later, would become Meadow Ridge Estates. Even more importantly, the survey included precise meets and bounds coordinates for the road corridor, tied to 2 stone monuments that Frank Delacroix, remarkably, remembered helping to set as a young surveyor's assistant back in the early 1960s. Those monuments, it turned out, were still there, buried under decades of grass and fence line, but still there when Frank and I went out with a metal detector and a shovel one Saturday morning and found them exactly where the survey said they'd be. The original survey didn't just support my claim. It obliterated the HOAs. The modern GIS status unverified label wasn't evidence of shared ownership at all. It was simply a case of a county mapping technician, decades later, failing to locate the original 1954 filing during a digitization project and defaulting to a placeholder status rather than doing the deeper archival research. In other words, the entire basis for Deborah's crusade was a clerical gap, not a legal right. I made copies of everything: the original survey, Frank's notarized statement about the monuments, updated GPS coordinates confirming the boundary, and I brought them straight to Carol at the County Road Department. She reviewed the documents for about 10 minutes, looked up at me, and said, "Mr. Bregman, I don't think there's any ambiguity here anymore. This road was never public. I'll update our GIS records to reflect that immediately, and I'd recommend you send a copy of this packet to the HOA's attorney directly, because if they keep pushing this, they're the ones opening themselves up to liability." I did exactly that. I mailed a certified copy of the entire packet, survey, statement, updated county correspondence, to the HOA's legal counsel, along with a short, polite cover letter making clear that any further use of my road by Meadow Ridge residents would be treated as trespassing, and that the county had already confirmed the private status of the easement in writing. I wish I could say Deborah backed down gracefully. She did not at first. About a week after the letter went out, she showed up at my gate again, this time with a printed copy of my own packet in hand, insisting that the handwritten notation on the old survey wasn't official and that she intended to have her own surveyor challenge it. I told her that was her right, but that in the meantime, my gate would remain locked, and any vehicle that came through it without my permission would be reported to the sheriff's department for trespassing, since the county had already confirmed, in writing, that the road was private. She hired a surveyor. I want to give her credit for that. At least, she didn't just fold. But 3 weeks later, that surveyor's report landed on her desk, and it confirmed everything Frank and I had already found. The 1954 survey was valid, properly filed, and legally binding, and the monuments matched modern GPS coordinates within a few inches. There was no shared easement. There never had been. The road belonged entirely to me, and had for 70 years. I found out through the neighborhood grapevine, because in a subdivision that's small, everyone hears everything eventually, that the HOA board held an emergency session after receiving that report. Apparently, several board members were furious that Deborah had spent HOA funds hiring a surveyor, and had escalated the situation to the point of threatening a longtime local farmer over a claim that turned out to be baseless. A few residents, embarrassed at the whole affair, reached out to me directly to apologize, including the man who'd driven through my gate that first morning. He told me he genuinely believed Deborah's claim at the time and felt foolish once the truth came out. Deborah herself never apologized to me directly, not that I ever expected her to. But at the HOA's next general meeting, which, out of morbid curiosity, I attended one more time, a motion was raised and passed to formally acknowledge that the North Access Corridor was private property belonging to the Bregman family, and to remove all HOA signage referencing it as a shortcut. The vote wasn't close. I heard, secondhand, that Deborah resigned from the board a few months later, citing personal reasons, though I suspect the reasons were a little less personal and a little more related to the fact that most of her neighbors no longer trusted her judgment. As for me, I had both ends of my gate reinforced with new posts, added a small sign of my own, nothing dramatic, just a simple notice referencing the recorded 1954 easement and the county's confirmation of private status, and filed a certified copy of the survey packet permanently with my property records, so that if anyone ever tries this again, whether it's this HOA or a future one, the answer will already be sitting right there in black and white. Looking back on the whole ordeal, what strikes me most isn't the conflict itself, though there was plenty of that. It's how close a 70-year-old truth came to being overwritten by a modern mapping error, and one determined woman's willingness to treat a placeholder label as gospel. If I hadn't taken Carol's advice seriously, if I hadn't tracked down Frank Delacroix, if that microfilm reel had been misplaced or damaged over the decades, this story might have ended very differently, with strangers cutting through my cattle pasture every morning on their way to the highway, and me with no real way to stop them. Instead, my grandfather's handshake agreement with his own surveyor back in 1954, memorialized in a few lines of careful, old-fashioned penmanship on a document that sat quietly in a courthouse archive for 7 decades, turned out to be exactly what I needed. It's a strange feeling, holding a piece of paper older than you are and realizing it's the thing standing between your family's land and someone else's convenience. These days, the road is quiet again. My cattle graze right up to the fence line without the rumble of SUVs cutting through at 7 in the morning. The gate stays locked, the way it always should have. And every once in a while, When I drive past the 2 old stone monuments Frank and I dug out of the grass that Saturday morning, I think about how a little bit of stubbornness, a lot of patience, and one very old piece of paper were enough to set the record straight. If there's a lesson in all of this, I suppose it's a simple one. Paperwork outlives arguments. People can raise their voices, waive printouts, and hire lawyers, but if you've got the truth sitting in a courthouse archive with a surveyor's signature on it, sooner or later, that truth tends to win. Deborah Kowalski learned that lesson the hard way, at her own expense, in front of the very community she was so eager to impress. And I learned that sometimes the best way to win a fight isn't to shout louder, it's to dig deeper, all the way back to where the story actually began. That's the whole story, start to finish, exactly the way it happened. The private farm road that's been in my family since 1954 is still private today, and now there's no map, no HOA resolution, and no laminated binder in the world that can say otherwise, because the original survey already settled the matter a long time before any of us were arguing about it.